Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Kauffman Entrepreneurship Issue Forum. We do these forums every month to explore key issues facing entrepreneurs and provide multiple perspectives about how to deal with those issues. We host this forum to provide a platform for discussion and to solve problems, and the Kauffman Foundation takes no political position or legislative position on these discussions. I would like to thank each of our panelists today for taking the time to share what they have learned and to raise important questions for all of us. When we think about the topic of the future of work and entrepreneurship and access to opportunity, I think that they have a lot of common elements in the sense that they're terms that have a lot of kind of loaded meaning. People have different perceptions when you use these words, and they encapsulate lots of different subtopics too. So to get us started, I want to share a little bit about the year 1776. Pretty big year, Declaration of Independence, the Wealth of Nations. But today I want to share a little about the steam engine. James Watt's steam engine was an improvement on an existing engine, and I don't know engines, so I won't get into too many details here, except that I want to think about the way that you would describe this new technology to a world that at the time would have been very difficult to understand what a machine is and what it can do, what it offers, what to compare it to. I think one of the advances that is a little bit surprising is to think about the term horsepower. So I had to look this up because I don't have a great sense of it myself, but horsepower is, 1 horsepower is 33,000 pounds of force per minute. Now, I know all those words. I don't know what they mean in that order exactly, but I think in a way it also doesn't matter because it gives us a general way to think about this new technology in terms that we might understand at the time. But this is very important in 1776, obviously, but it has some really long-term consequences. We still use the term horsepower today to talk about engines. Well, not that I talk about engines very often, but when I do, I get a general sense, that my Civic has many fewer horsepower than my neighbor's truck, for example. But sometimes we don't use new words to describe something that changes. And I think about a more recent example, phone. Just 20 years ago, phone was something that made calls. Now, if you ask my daughters what I use my phone for, I'm not sure they know that it does that. And I was sharing an early version of this with a colleague, and she shared a story about when she went and got her first Apple phone. She went to the Apple store, a Mac Genius, set up her email, apps, contacts. Then when she got to her car to call her husband to tell her about her phone, she realized she didn't know how to make a call. And I think that's interesting in a few ways because the word phone got kind of adapted to mean something else. And that's certainly one way to think about the way that technology affects us and how we might address how and why the language we use matters so much. And a year or two ago, I got the privilege of being able to see Hal Varian on your screen here present about some related topics. And he had a line that really stuck out with me, which was when he said that my grandfather wouldn't recognize what I do as work. And that's just another example, I guess, of thinking through that the ways that people work, live, it changes over times, and our language doesn't always change with that. And so when we use the same word, people with different backgrounds, different experiences may think differently. They may have different definitions in their head. And when we think about topics related to entrepreneurship and technology and workers and automation, we often, it can be easy to think about these topics in the sense of like automation is a machine replacing a job. It's a little more nuanced, of course, than that. And it's because a job is a combination of multiple tasks, some of which are easy to automate and others aren't. And it's not always obvious exactly how it will manifest itself. Jim Besson and others looked at bank tellers and saw that when ATMs became into prominence, that it didn't foretell the immediate end of a bank teller. In fact, the number of bank tellers went up because banks opened up more locations. It was much cheaper to open up multiple smaller locations that could now be staffed with fewer people. And the role of a bank teller changed as well to be a little bit less on cash handling and management to more customer service and more personal traits and cross-selling services. That lasts only for so long, as I think maybe those numbers of employment numbers have gone down. But it's just to say that transition is not always so sudden or obvious as new technology infiltrates into the world, and the consequences, the second order effects, can be really large. And in context of these topics, why these topics today, and how do they relate to each other? And I think that they're all part of this emerging story. We're going through a pretty massive systems change. And there are some tremendously great things about that, but I think there's also a lot of things that should give us cause and concern. And chief among them is who gets to participate in these changes? To what degree is everyone included and prepared to take advantage of the tremendous opportunities ahead of us? We can think about the various skills that people might need, the skills that we would have said that entrepreneurs need to be successful, like complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity. Those are increasingly going to be skills that all workers will need to be successful. And then when we think about entrepreneurship, that a traditional definition of entrepreneur being someone who starts a new business and employs others, that is certainly going to continue to be an important part of our economy, and we should be concerned when we face headwinds in making that happen. But how do we talk about the work that is adjacent to that type of entrepreneurship, or perhaps leads to it, or is a substitute for it? Things like independent contracting, side hustles, gig economy, the platform economy, freelance work, building up a portfolio of work, building up your personal brand. Those lead to the needs for things like lifelong learning, the ability to train a workforce that is able to take advantage of all of those things. And again, that starts to get at thinking about technology in new ways, thinking about the other AI, that technology can be there to augment our intelligence and lead to better outcomes. But again, it really depends on, will everybody have access to that? And I think about some of the language we use, like we have some language that maybe makes a little bit less sense to describe the way people live and work. Things like job, firm, productivity, they're important numbers. And I think that they will continue to be for quite some time. But are there other measures we should also be thinking about? And how do we measure things like meaningful work or inclusive prosperity? Do we think about these things do we think about this like horsepower, where we need to create new words to describe what's going on? Or do we need to expand our definitions? Or is that already happening? When someone asks what you do for a living, the inclination may be to describe your job. But what if your job is not traditional? Sometimes people understand what that means, and sometimes they don't. And so I think that we're at a pretty pivotal moment where we have to think about the way that we will talk about the work people do. And there are multiple ways to think about this, and I'm so excited for all of the panelists we have today, because we'll be able to further this conversation in a meaningful way. And in order to kind of get into these issues a little more directly, we've divided everything into two panels. Our first panelist will be speaking about how technology affects workers, and entrepreneurship. And again, like I mentioned earlier, these are really complex topics, and that they can ultimately end up covering a lot of subtopics. And then for the second hour of our forum, we'll be getting deeper into what does it really take to have inclusive prosperity in a digital world. And I think part of that is to think about the ways that we might think about these topics and these definitions. I guess that's why there was so much focus in what I said there on the language we use. It really matters. And I'm really excited to get into that first panel now. So without further ado, I want to introduce all four panelists, and then we'll get started with our first presentation. Our first panelist will be Katharine G. Abraham, Professor of Economics and Survey Methodology at the University of Maryland. Then Dr. Susan Houseman, Vice President and Director of Research at W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. Louis R. Hyman, Newfield Professor of Industrial Relations and History, ILR School, Cornell University. And Christopher Stanton, Marvin Bauer Associate Professor, Harvard Business School. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Katharine.
Great. Thank you very much, Derek. And I think your comments lead very naturally into what I wanted to talk about, which is something I've spent a lot of my time thinking about in the last few years, which is the ongoing shift, or what appears to be an ongoing shift, towards the increased use of contract workers, contracting out more generally. Part of that is the gig economy, jobs work mediated through online platforms, which has been modest in scale to date, but certainly experiencing rapid growth. But really more generally, what I see as what David Weil has described as the fissuring of the workforce, the moving of activities that previously might have been done inside the firm to outside of the firm, contracting out to other firms or to individuals doing work that employees might previously have done. I have to say that given the limitations of available data, it's a little bit hard to pin down what's been happening, but there is, I think, good reason to believe there's been real growth in the prevalence of independent contractor work as part of this broader phenomenon of growth in contracting out, and that technology has been an important part of the story. Just to think about what the data tell us, one of the puzzles in the data is that if you look at household survey data, such as data from the Current Population Survey, which is our big monthly survey that tracks what's going on in the labor market, you don't see any growth at all in self-employment over the last 20 to 25 years, which is where this contracting out to independent contractors should show up. That said, there's been recent research, I've been involved in some of it, showing that these surveys miss at least some of the people who are doing independent contract work on a more informal or irregular basis, that they don't do a good job of capturing people who do independent contract work on the side, and that in some cases, people who are really working as independent contractors are being miscategorized as employees, and so we're just not seeing them. Where you do see considerable evidence of growth in self-employment and growth in work as an independent, growth in independent contractor work specifically is in the tax data. So I'm convinced that what we are seeing a growth in this sort of independent contractor work. And it also, I think, is part of a more general trend towards fragmentation of production, increased contracting out more generally. In the manufacturing sector, you can see, for example, that the adoption of computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing technologies have been associated with increases in contracting out. Teresa Ford at Dartmouth has done some super interesting work on that. There's evidence that the development of more sophisticated logistical and monitoring systems have contributed to fissuring, fragmentation in the retail sector, the hotel sector, the trucking sector, and other sectors. David Weil has done a lot of work on that. And then one final piece of evidence is the fact that there's been a lot of growth in segregation of employment across firms based on the skill level of the employees, which is consistent, again, with more contracting out. There's a lot of reasons why firms might want to move towards using more contract workers. One reason is that it gives them more flexibility to adjust wages. In an internal labor market, it may be hard to change people's relative pay. It's easier to do if you're contracting out to some other firm or some other to an individual. There may be cases in which firms contract out because they want to shed the legal responsibilities that they would have for employees. Firms may see contracting out using independent contractors as a way to buffer against fluctuations in demand. It may be a way to take advantage of specialized expertise. So there's a lot of reasons why firms might want to do this. But I think that new technologies also have played a role by lowering the transaction costs associated with doing that. The availability of platforms, the availability of more standardized technologies that a lot of people in an industry may be familiar with and use, may contribute to lowering the search costs associated with finding somebody outside the firm to do things. It may lower the costs of bargaining and coming to a decision about the tasks and how it's going to be priced. It may make it easier to monitor what people are doing so that you can be confident that someone outside the firm is actually doing what you needed to have done. So I think technology has been an important factor in what we're seeing. This growth in independent contractor work can be either better for workers or worse for workers. A lot of the attention on the growth of independent contracting has focused on concerns that use of independent contractors is a way for firms to lower what they're paying to workers and a way to shift risks from the firm to the workers. So it's a fairly negative view that's been evident in much of what's been written about this. But when you look at data on what people who are working as independent contractors say about their work, in data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics from the Contingent Worker Supplement, for example, 4 out of 5 people who were categorized as independent contractors on their main job said that they preferred that to a different arrangement. So it's not obvious that it's bad for people. And then there's a whole set of people who are using work as an independent contractor to supplement their earnings from a primary job or to supplement their earnings from a pension. So I think it's complicated, and that sort of affects how we think about policy. On the one hand, labor market laws and regulations really were designed for a world in which most workers had an employer. So if you're an independent contractor, you don't enjoy the same legal and social insurance protections as an employee. You don't have access to unemployment insurance. You don't have access to workers' compensation. And so that's a concern. On the other hand, working as an independent contractor may be ideal for somebody who wants to supplement their income or who places a high value on flexibility and control over their schedule. Some research that Susan Houseman, who's also on the panel, Brad Hirschbein and I have done shows that work as an independent contractor accounts for a very large percentage of employment at older ages, especially among more educated older workers. And you can see why that might be very attractive for someone who's phasing into retirement. So I think the challenge is really how to provide appropriate protections for people who are relying on independent contractor work for their livelihood without shutting off opportunities that many people find attractive. So let me stop there.
Great, thank you so much. A lot of questions already baking in my head, but before we get to the Q&A, let's turn now to Dr. Susan Houseman. Susan?
Great, thanks very much, Derek, and thank you, Katharine. I, like Katharine, have been really focused in much of my recent research on kind of understanding the growth of independent contracting and other types of contracting out and the pros and cons of all of that. So let me elaborate a bit on what Katharine has said. But first, I think it's really important to acknowledge at the outset that one of the greatest concerns about the growth of technology has been that it will displace workers and cause widespread unemployment. That, fundamentally, there won't be enough work to go around. Yet, as demonstrated by a recent report from coming out of MIT on Work of the Future, there's no indication that this is happening, it has happened historically, or is happening now. And this is basically because technology, while it does obviate the need for some jobs, it creates new jobs and opportunities. And as Katharine pointed out, technology can also influence the nature of the employment arrangement and opportunities for entrepreneurship. So if we think back to the last century, the logic of the large integrated companies that dominated mid-20th century was that people had to be part of the same company to coordinate business. Kind of arm's length transactions with people on the outside were costly to businesses. This was pointed out by business historians like Alfred Chandler and Oliver Williamson. But also, as Katharine pointed out, in recent decades, we've seen what David Weil has called the fissuring of the workplace, or those working in the area of globalization have called the slicing up of the value chain and other things. So companies have outsourced many functions, both to contract companies as well as to independent contractors. There's many factors that have contributed to this phenomenon, but one is technology, including the great improvements in communications technology that make it easier to coordinate with parties outside the company. There are valid concerns about the decline, what appears to be the decline, at least to some degree, in the traditional employer-employee arrangement. For example, independent contractors are self-employed, so they're not protected by employment and labor laws, unemployment insurance and workers' compensation, and they're ineligible for employer-provided benefits. But technological developments that undermine the traditional employer-employee arrangement also kind of open up lots of opportunities. Let me just name a few. Perhaps most obviously, the internet arguably has made it much easier for entrepreneurs to set up businesses and to sell their services or goods to clients anywhere in the country or even the world. Associated or paralleling the growth of the internet has been platforms on the internet that have received tremendous policy attention in recent years. And one important function of many platforms is to make it easier for entrepreneurs to establish businesses. For instance, a lot of people have focused on the rideshare platforms, which have been very big, but Upwork, which is the largest platform that serves individuals who perform all their tasks online, boasts that many people use its platform to do so. Many people who use that platform use it to help set up a consulting or freelancing business. That platform, as Katharine mentioned, facilitates connections with potential clients. It also, I think, quite importantly, handles payments, which can be a significant barrier for entrepreneurs wishing to transact business online. Similarly, eBay and Etsy have enabled many people to set up online stores, again, by providing a platform to help these people connect with customers and handling the payments through things like PayPal. They don't have the high costs of establishing a physical store, and the risks are lower. In short, the internet and company platforms on the internet have arguably dramatically cut the costs of setting up certain types of businesses, and we're seeing the growth of that now. One also might wonder what the long-term effects of the current COVID pandemic will be on the nature of employment. That's really hard to know. But arguably, it may lead to a large permanent increase in outsourcing in independent contracting. And here's why. We know that many businesses have gained experience in managing remote work. In May, according to the current population survey, at the peak, May was sort of the peak of business closures in the United States. About 1/3 of the employed reported working virtually in the prior 4 weeks because of the virus. My organization, for instance, probably like many of yours, moved from allowing virtually no work one day to nearly 100% remote work a few days later. And this was across all occupations in the business. Like most organizations, we had to quickly adopt new technologies to communicate and adapt the way to manage people using these new technologies. The transition for us, like many, wasn't always smooth. It was quite challenging. There was a lot of learning going on, but it was much easier than I think we anticipated. We certainly would have anticipated prior to starting this. So my point is that once an organization learns to manage remote work, it's arguably a short jump to working more with contractors. The logic of hiring someone as an employee who comes to the office to interact 5 days a week is less compelling. The situation, again, let me reinforce what Katharine said and what I said just a minute ago, raises some concerns. The whole foundation for our current social safety net to protect workers from abuse of those using their services, and to support them during downturns was established nearly 100 years ago with a traditional employer-employee arrangement in mind. And that social safety net, or what some call the social compact, needs to be rethought. But it undoubtedly offers opportunities for entrepreneurship, and it's a situation we're going to be monitoring, need to monitor very closely. Let me just close. I wanted to pick up on something that Derek said in his opening remarks. And I think there are really valid concerns about kind of what the opportunities for entrepreneurship are going to be moving forward. We typically, in the examples that I used, have been online work. It certainly is not all entirely highly reserved for highly educated people. The examples of eBay stores and Etsy stores are certainly done by many people of all education levels. It doesn't require a college degree, as one example. But likely it is disproportionately those office work, entails office work, which disproportionately is professional and managerial occupations. So that's a potential cause for concern in the future. Let me stop there.
Great, thank you so much. So I want to reiterate something, a point, actually not reiterate, maybe say for the first time, to please take note that we have an opportunity for question and answers from all the attendees. So please feel free to add questions at the bottom, and we'll try to get to them in our Q&A session. Now we'll be turning to Louis Hyman.
Hi there, I'm Louis Hyman. I'm an economic historian, but in a lot of ways, I'm going to echo what we just heard before, building on what Katharine and Susan said. So early in 2019, remember before COVID, the New York Times had a stunning headline: Google's shadow workforce, temps who outnumber full-time employees. And this seemed impossible. How could our flagship corporation not be delivering the good life to its workers? That is stable work. But this contradiction was neither new nor accidental. To understand why Google has more contractors than employees in 2019, we need to understand that this disposable workforce is why Silicon Valley has been so successful for the past 50 years. And in this talk, I'm going to understand just briefly, we only have a few minutes, to think about insecurity and Silicon Valley and technology. But that categorizing of some workers as disposable while others are seen as everything is at the root of Silicon Valley, but more essentially how we have rethought all of our workforces since we came out of the post-war era around 1970. In a fundamental sense, employment itself has failed a broad swath of the American working class for a very long time. So if we let Silicon Valley determine the future of work, I think it will look more like the same. More of us, more disposable. But this thinking about who matters and who doesn't is at the root of big tech. Just consider the announcement of the very first Macintosh plant in Fremont in 1984. Machines building machines. This seems very much like the hype around AI today. And in this futurist fantasy, there's no need for people except for maybe programmers and engineers and, of course, CEOs. We are all transitional workforces for a better future that somehow never arrives, and if it does, doesn't benefit all of us. Now, Apple's factory, you won't be surprised, was shockingly old-fashioned. To understand the electronics industry was and is simple. Every time someone says robot, simply picture a migrant woman of color. Instead of self-aware robots, workers, nearly all women, mostly immigrant, hunch over tables assembling parts. And this is the kind of work that robots and AI in the future does. It sort of erases people in this sort of and we've begun to, in the work of Katharine and Susan and other people, to reclaim this distortion of reality over who and what matters and how we should think about the future. But that's not the only problem that we're having. We also have a strange amnesia about the last 50 years as we talk about the future of work, because it's been 50 years since 1970. That's twice as long as the post-war itself. And yet we still imagine that this post-war is the normal. But for 50 years, that kind of post-war work has been in decline. And it's been this shift from stable work to unstable work, from valued to disposable, that's become more visible since 2008, which Derek was suggesting in his open remarks. With the centrality of big tech to our lives and our economy, with all these things, this insecurity in turn has been blamed on Uber and apps and AI, but the real change has been in work relationships over those 50 years. Technology is only consolidating a work that has been long in formation. So for instance, the Industrial Revolution depended on the steam engine, but the steam engine was only useful because workers were under one roof in a factory, not in their homes. This industrious revolution predated the steam engine by 100 years. The technology was only useful because of the social reorganization. And today, this is also true. These companies can take advantage of our insecurity because we have been rendered more insecure. And the story here is about leanness, just-in-time production, and all the corporate reorganizations, that is, deindustrialization and downsizing and outsourcing, and eventually the gig economy. This is the arc. This is not about apps. And yet somehow all these moments have been forgotten in the rush to the future of work. Remember Walmart? It provided unstable hours and low pay long before Uber. So in this sense, this is a world where workers are already disposable. Uber is a symptom, not a cause. Uber is possible because the service economy and employment more generally has failed the American worker. So roll back Uber, all the other gig economies, and Amazon, and you are still in the world of staggering inequality and staggering income volatility, which is something we talk less about. So the future of work is at a crossroads, but the answer is moving forward, not backward, to try and figure out how we can use this technology, and technology does matter, but we want it to help us reinforce how we value one another and how we value our relationships. And to do that, we need to be cognizant of this history, to be cognizant of the fact that this is not simply flipping a switch and rolling back one app or one company, but to rethink how we relate to one another and what we value. So on the one hand, there's a path forward, which is the default path, is underpaid gig workers. But just as possible is an expansive micro-entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship is only very rarely about IPO billionaires. Usually it is about the self-determination that comes from small business. So while we often talk about the American dream in terms of consumption, there's another American dream that's more visceral, and that is control over one's work. And this older American dream, a Jeffersonian vision of independent farmers, was undercut by a rising industrialization that turned us into a nation of wage earners, who in turn depended on a boss for a wage. And that's more or less an entire semester of labor history. But then the New Deal order turned these jobs into stable, well-paying jobs. But it was still wage labor, and you still lived your life on the boss's clock. You got paid, but you didn't have control. And through the same New Deal, which made those good jobs, we made it easy to own a home, but hard to own our own businesses. So what does this mean? So for those in the gig economy, this promise of control over one's time is the lure. And it's where this blurry language, like Derek was talking about, of entrepreneurship really matters. This is how you get people into driving their cars. But for these people, as shifts get cut at the restaurant, at the store, they can drive their car, deliver food to make ends meet. The pay isn't great and it varies a lot, but it makes the difference between making rent or not. So this isn't supplementary income. This is necessary income when work fails people. In one survey, 3/4 of Uber drivers cite the instability of their income as the main reason for driving, and they're not alone. Just a few years ago, JP Morgan made a big study where they found that a little more than half of the median households in America had month-to-month fluctuations of income of 30%. Just try to, I imagine many people on this call have salaries and they budget their income, but try to imagine budgeting with that kind of income swing. Most of that variation in income, 86%, came from variation in pay within distinct jobs. That is, it wasn't about people switching jobs. It was about the shift work that was unreliable. And salaried people like me, and probably like you, have a hard time understanding what it's like for the 60% of Americans who work by the hour. So talk to anyone who has control over their time and you hear the same answer: as long as I can make enough, I would never go back. So many kinds of platform work like Uber, and here I show some data from a recent study I did with a team at Cornell showing the variation in income. And this is very different than a traditional job where there are people doing the same exact work and getting paid quite different amounts. But it is still a kind of freedom. And that's the real question. How do we provide security while providing freedom? In one future, the digital economy might have the best of both worlds: the autonomy and independence of a Jeffersonian economy before wage labor, but with individuals possessed of the productive capacity of an industrial economy. And this is what Susan was talking about. Corporations are not new, but platforms are. And if anything's really novel right now, it's the platform, because the platform allows individuals to globally produce, globally market, and source global talent that only multinationals could do before. But this will only be successful if we supply those entrepreneurs with capital and with security. Now, this is the appeal of Etsy, to do one example. Etsy has 2.5 million sellers, and Etsy is often ignored in these conversations. So why is that? And I think it's very simple. So if Uber is the all-male digital job, 86% men, then Etsy is the nearly all-female gig shop. And it's hard not to see that the gender of the male drivers and the female sellers is the deciding difference in their importance in the public conversation. Men deserve real work while women don't. Yet for the women of Etsy, their micro businesses are quite real. And a third of the sellers, about 800,000 people, or about 700,000 women, consider this their full-time job. So that women are succeeding in the digital economy like they never did in the industrial economy, yet we are still not supporting them or even treating this like a real job. There are many paths forward to an industrial workforce, and you can't swing a cat in DC without hitting a think tank that has a white paper on portable benefits. But to make this change, we need to start with acknowledging that the system is not working for either workers or entrepreneurs. We need to make sure that capital flows to small businesses, whether they are sexy tech startups or expanding plumbing supply companies or micro entrepreneurs on Etsy. And right now, we can easily securitize consumer debt, but we don't securitize business debt. So we need to make it easier to invest in one another than to lend money for shopping. And this is the path back to a virtuous cycle of capitalist growth. And at the same time, we need to make sure that security in income, in health, and in childcare is not tied to an employer, so that risk takers could become entrepreneurs and create jobs for other Americans. But they won't do this if they are afraid. And people right now are afraid. So that the COVID shock has pushed even the most precarious of us into even more precarious positions, especially African Americans and Latinos and people who only have a high school degree. And of course, the service economy, which is the backbone of the American working class, has been gutted. But whatever course we take, we need to make choices. The economy has changed, but our institutions have not. And we must ask the same question again now, even if we answer it differently in 2020 than in 1945. Who counts? Who deserves, if not guaranteed work, then at least secure lives? In the post-war, we drew a line between white men and everybody else. So as we ask these questions, we should abandon our nostalgia for a world that excluded so many and was only there for a moment. We must not just simply remake this post-war world, because even for those who found security, those white men who had the good paychecks, working on an assembly line or in a mine was dehumanizing and backbreaking work. And even for those in bureaucratic offices, it was soul-breaking. Whatever the wages and benefits, humans should not do the work of robots. And the challenge for the 21st century will not be defending our robot-like jobs or tasks, but discovering what is valuable in being human and supporting that. So we don't need to stop technological progress to have social progress. This is not an economic question fundamentally, or a technological question, but a political one, because power determines the distribution of those gains. And so we need to understand that this flexible workforce can, depending on the choices that we make, either be the liberation from wage work, from the office, from the factory, that Americans have so long yearned for, or damnation to live insecure lives in an unequal society. But the choice is up to us, not the apps. Thank you so much. And this is my book that I'm drawing this from on the right.
Thank you, Louis. Next, we have Christopher Stanton. So Chris, when you're ready.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I have basically spent the last 7 months sitting in my basement tracking what's happening with COVID. And I'll share just a little bit about some of that work today, but I also want to just talk in maybe a bit more detail about some patterns around remote work and what we're seeing in terms of sort of the shift in remote work, because that might, as I think Susan mentioned, provide some ability to think through whether I think we've seen firms that have sort of made a transition to working remotely that may have some ability to engage in additional contracting out or with a change in employment model. And so that's kind of what I was hoping to talk through today, but through the lens of the COVID shock. And I want to really just touch on three things. The first is primarily what was happening with remote work prior to COVID-19. And I'll try to address questions like where was it occurring and who was doing it. Then it was mentioned earlier that remote work has increased in light of COVID-19, and I think that that's not surprising, but I think there's a question about whether remote work is going to persist, and I have at least a little bit of evidence to share on that. And then I also want to do some real-time tracking of gig work, acknowledging that this is completely imperfect and is going to rely on a CPS definition of unincorporated self-employed. So those are just sort of the three high points, and I think that this ties into what all of the other presenters have talked about so far. So question number one is what was happening in terms of remote work around levels, trends, and a split between who was engaging in remote work prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this figure is from data from the ACS through 2005 and the 2000 census. And the census data allows you to at least get some handle on remote work because the ACS and the census tend to track where work is happening because these data products are useful for planning transit infrastructure. And so one question that they ask respondents is, if you were at work, where were you working? What was your commute time or whatever? And one of the options of that question is that you were working at home. And so this figure just plots the rate of working from home out of the ACS data from 2000 with a gap between 2000 and 2005 up through 2017. And basically what you'll see is that no more than about 7% of the workforce was working from home. The number is quite a bit lower than that because these series are split. The number as of 2017 was under 5%. But you can see that there's growth in remote work or working from home for what Jonathan Dingle and Brent Nyman at the University of Chicago using ONET data have characterized as teleworkable jobs, or jobs that, based on the description of what is done at a task level, don't necessarily require co-location with either a customer or someone else, or a piece of physical capital that is immobile. So a laptop is a piece of physical capital, but you can move it around. A factory floor or another piece of heavy equipment tends not to be, and so that requires some co-location. And you can see that this classification does reasonably well. There is some measurement error because people who are in occupations that are not teleworkable do occasionally sort of work from home, but those in teleworkable occupations did see some gains in remote work between the 2005 period and 2017. But overall, this was not a huge share of the labor force engaged in remote production. Now, if you ask yourself, where were these people located? I'll show you three different specifications that attempt to answer that question. And in all three of these figures, the categories correspond to the average wage in a commuting zone. And the variation that is captured in these figures is just sort of the average expense that one would have in terms of paying compensation expenses, but that is sort of correlated with the firm's wage bill, and for most of these commuting zones would be correlated with the cost of property as well. And what you see in terms of all of these specifications when you look at this relationship with no controls for occupation or demographics, or when you control for demographics, or when you control for demographics and occupations, is that the top quartile of commuting zones in terms of average cost or average wages has lower rates of remote work than the next highest quartile. And so there's this inverse U-shaped relationship between where remote work was occurring and the cost of labor in a city. And what I think that this means is that there is an important role for something like agglomeration. So a software engineer who was living in San Francisco was much less likely to be a remote worker than a software engineer who was living in a place like Boise, Idaho. And the software engineer in San Francisco turns out to also be a little bit younger on average, and is probably going to benefit from learning on the job in a different way than someone who is more experienced. All of this kind of suggests that if you think about why firms were paying for co-location or why they were paying high rents, that as of 2017, 2016, 2015, remote work was possible, and you see it in some uptick in the numbers, but it wasn't as widespread as one might have imagined just based on the technological capability to pull it off. So with that background, you did certainly see the acceleration of remote work through the pandemic. In May, 35.4% of CPS respondents reported that they were teleworking. As of October, that number had fallen to 21.2% of respondents. And you can kind of see that that number is falling. There are demographic differences in who's doing it. And then one of the things that we tried to do early on in the pandemic with survey data through Alignable, which is a small business network with 5 million members, is to try and see how people in the small business sector had responded. And one of the things that we found is that that Dingle and Nyman measure of teleworkability did a great job when you aggregate up to the industry level of predicting who was teleworking or who was adopting remote work during the pandemic. The next thing we asked in Alignable and in a survey of business economists through the National Association of Business Economists is a question about remote worker productivity. And what we found is that the change in remote worker productivity when we asked respondents to benchmark this relative to in-office productivity is that remote worker productivity is widely dispersed. The average and median response in terms of the change in productivity when moving to remote work is minus 16 on a negative 100 to 100 scale, but about a third of the respondents reported that productivity increased relative to their in-office productivity, shown in this histogram on the screen. And we then followed this up by trying to assess whether these respondents thought that the shift in remote work that was documented was going to be persistent. And using those numbers, we found that about 16% of the workforce might remain remote at least 2 days a week. Now, there are some caveats here. The first is that these numbers were taken early in the pandemic from April and May. And I think that if you're just introspective at all, it probably will dawn on you that there's burnout and people kind of miss some aspects of the office. But if you believe these numbers, I think it raises questions about some of the future of cities. As I showed you earlier, that remote work was much less likely to be happening in expensive places. And places like San Francisco have already seen outmigration and a reduction in rents over the course of the pandemic. And that might be consistent with some move to a more remote future. Now, I think that there's an open question about whether this is going to translate into more gig work or not. I've written on some of the value of like connective tissue in the firm and what spillovers between coworkers might mean in terms of productive outcomes. But over the course of the pandemic, if you look at CPS data, there has been an uptick relative to other forms of employment in unincorporated self-employment. Now, unincorporated self-employment is going to capture more than a shift to gig work, but you can see in this figure that if you look at what is in sort of the orange circles, that relative to sort of other forms of employment, the unincorporated self-employment does tick up in terms of headcount, where you see something that is roughly like 500,000 people reporting that they're unincorporated self-employed over sort of the course of April, May, relative to a prior trend. So anyway, I think that there are real questions about whether this is going to persist. Once the Pfizer vaccine was announced, you saw that Zoom's stock price, which was above 500, dropped to 400 the next day. Upwork had reported their revenue and gross platform volume was up 24% year over year, but these are still relatively tiny numbers in the grand scheme of things. And I think that there's an open and really fascinating question around what Susan raised about whether this is going to lead to a more persistent shift. Because if firms have figured out how to work remotely, does that mean that they're going to contract out more in the future? Anyway, thanks very much and really appreciate being here.
Thank you. And I wanted to reiterate to all the attendees that the Q&A is there for you to ask questions. We are a little short on time, so we probably will not be able to get to all of them, but it's possible some of the panelists may be able to address them in the Q&A panel itself. But I did want to start, I think, with one of the questions posed in the Q&A, which is thinking through what does it really take if the exact question is to expand independent contracting effectively. Changes in policy regarding the definition of employee versus contractor will be needed. This will have this will impact taxation policy, FICA, unemployment. Has there been any activity on this front? If so, can you describe? So I'll just kind of open that up. I know that there's been some work. There's certainly many proposals, or at least a few, on like a third classification of worker, and there are multiple ways that that could be done. But I think I'd turn it over if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Well, let me, Louis may have some thoughts as well, working with the Aspen Institute on this, but there's certainly for a number of years has been a lot of thinking about how to reconfigure the, social, what Senator Warner calls the social compact. And the focus there was really on the platform work, the gig platform work. And so there's been kind of some experimentation around on the sides. What we saw with Prop 22 in California passing was something of a hybrid of employment arrangements, where one could heavily debate whether that was a good idea to carve out one little industry and give them an exception of employment laws. But that's what they're doing. They're sort of, having a model that partially treats them as employees with minimum wages and allows them to get some benefits, but not be treated as employees for other purposes. There's been a lot of interest in allowing platforms to extend benefits to independent contractors, but there's a lot more that needs to be done, to ensure that provide better access to health insurance and Social Security benefits, and just unemployment insurance is a big sticking point. Katharine and I have recently talked about how one might extend at least some modicum of unemployment insurance to the self-employed and the like. So a little bit of work has been done on that, some of it through the Aspen Institute, more to be done.
Just to add one thing to what Susan was saying, she mentioned the issue related to access to health insurance. I think one thing all of this really raises is the problems that arise when access to health insurance is mediated through a relationship with an employer. I do think that's something that we really need to be rethinking. From my perspective, health insurance access to health care is something that should be a right for people rather than something that maybe they get and maybe they don't. And if to the extent that we really are moving towards more people being independent contractors rather than employees, some different arrangement in my mind really seems called for.
And the challenge here is political, that the people who feel like these laws are actually defending their interests are unwilling to allow some new kind of formation to exist for fear that they would lose more ground. And that's a perfectly reasonable, this is what you saw in the fight over AB5 and Prop 22. And just like Susan said, that there was an unfortunate carve out, because the vast majority of independent contractors are not on digital platforms, right? They're working in other kinds of ways, but they also need health insurance. They also need childcare. They need unemployment. So I think it's this problem where we imagine that this whole space is Uber or Uber-like, and it's absolutely not.
So I have a slightly different perspective, and my perspective around AB5 is that you need to distinguish unemployment benefits from other types of benefits. The liquidity that Uber provides is extraordinarily valuable relative to consumption smoothing. And I think if you look at work from Dimitri Koustas and others, this suggests that Uber is actually a substitute for unemployment insurance rather than something that would require unemployment insurance. I think if you think about other benefits, there is more debate around what types of benefits should be provided. But if you compare job search or spells of unemployment when you don't have income coming in on a digital platform versus a traditional job, there's no reason in normal times, and the pandemic is an exception, that you would need sort of the insurance against the idiosyncratic shock. You would need insurance against sort of individual health shocks that would prevent you from driving, and you would need insurance against a macro shock that would contract the entire sector. But in normal times, Uber itself has been shown to provide liquidity for people who have experienced employment loss.
If I could just jump in and yes, you are absolutely right in the context of Uber. That's been established by Koustas, some nice work by JP Morgan Chase Institute and the like. And it's also, as Katharine and I have written, using broader data on sort of informal work. This seems to be used quite a lot to, secondary jobs to handle shocks. But that's not we have to be really careful about sort of using the Uber example and then talking about the macro economy, because lots of people work as independent contractors and that is their primary job. So, and they do experience shocks. And so there is a valid policy question about how that should be handled, in part, as you mentioned, the macro shocks, the health shocks, or the idiosyncratic shocks that hit people. And those that are most liable are those who are, relatively poor. And we might think about a system that assists those, a means-tested unemployment benefit.
Yeah, I totally agree, but I think that it is important to sort of recognize more and less liquid options and to think about how to experience rate what someone would pay for, because in normal times, an idiosyncratic sort of shock should require different payments than someone who is in a more volatile sector than others. And for most of the time, Uber is a relatively sort of liquid option where the time between jobs is short compared to, say, an independent consultant who might go months without work.
It's also really interesting. Uber, we did a study a few months ago that used Uber and Lyft's administrative data, and there was such enormous number of people. The vast majority of drivers were driving extremely short periods of time, less than 10 hours a week. So, it is this heterogeneity, I think, in the gig economy, the gig workers, that is so difficult for us to imagine. We want to imagine that they are all full-time, or they are all one way or one other thing, but it's the heterogeneity that makes it very difficult to create a one-size-fit-all policy. And I forget which panelist said that before, but I just really want to re-emphasize that.
Thank you so much. We have so many more questions, both from the chat and I'm sure percolating in everybody else's head as well too. Unfortunately, we're running short on time, so encourage the panelists, if they so choose, to feel free to respond, written on the Q&A. But I did want to make sure we have time for the second half of our forum, where we'll be moving into talking about, what does this topic look like when we think about it? And this has already been highlighted by, I think, all of the panelists, like inclusive prosperity in a digital world, thinking through how do we make sure that the issues we're talking about today are prepared for everyone. And in order to get us started, I wanted to first introduce the four people we'll be hearing from before I turn it over to our first speaker. But we'll be beginning with Lisa Corsetto, Policy Manager at the Abdul Latif Jamal Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL at MIT. And we'll be hearing from Giselle Mota, the Principal Future of Work MS at ADP, and Kristin Sharp, CEO of the Education Quality Outcome Standards Board, and Dr. Jim Spohrer, Director, Cognitive Open Tech Group, COG at IBM Research. And so first, I'd like to turn it over to Lisa to get us started.
So thank you so much, Derek, and the Kauffman Foundation for this invitation to be a part of this really important conversation. So as Derek mentioned, I work at JPAL, which is a research center based in the economics department at MIT. We work with a network of researchers who use randomized evaluations or randomized control trials to evaluate the impact of social programs. And a lot of my work focuses on low and middle income country labor markets. But my hope is that some of the key lessons we're learning and kind of research questions we're asking can be useful for this group, thinking more specifically about the US context. So I just kind of wanted to share what perspective I'm coming at today. So as we have this conversation around the intersection of an increasingly digital labor market and inclusive prosperity, the question that I want to reflect on is how leveraging technology can increase job seekers' access to work. And so while securing a job is of course just one piece of the puzzle, and there's obviously much bigger questions around the quality of that job, getting a sort of foot in the door, we think, is often an important first step to increased prosperity, especially when we think about youth, women, or other groups who tend to be more excluded in a lot of labor markets. And we can imagine ways in which technology could both reduce and exacerbate existing inequalities. So in a lot of labor markets, for example, referral-based hiring is really common, but may disadvantage workers with less social connections. So technology platforms that connect workers and job seekers could reduce these inequalities by creating alternative ways for job seekers to signal their qualifications. But technology could also increase inequalities if job seekers have unequal access to these technology platforms in the first place. And when we think about the role of technology in increasing inclusive job access to jobs, I think it's helpful to set this question within the broader conversation around what barriers people face when they're looking for work, and what are effective strategies to reduce those job search barriers. So we've done a review recently of some global evidence on these topics and found that programs focused on reducing job search barriers often improved employment outcomes through a few main channels: by helping job seekers identify where and how to look for work, encouraging increased search effort, and helping job seekers communicate their qualifications to employers. These strategies seem particularly important as we think about how widespread layoffs during the pandemic are dismantling matches in the labor market, and job loss has been highest for low-wage workers. And so there's going to be really a large need to rebuild matches as economies recover. So I wanted to quickly go over a couple of examples of what the research looks like in this sort of reducing job search barrier space, and then I'll close by outlining what we see as a few key open questions for further research at the intersection of this topic of job search and technology. So I'll start with a study of a behavior-based intervention that encouraged job seekers to engage in more productive job search activities. So this took place in South Africa in partnership with the Department of Labor, who already had a job search workshop program for youth who were unemployed. And in this study, the Department of Labor added on a component to the workshop that gave youth a planning template to fill out with detailed information about their search plans, including specific and concrete weekly goals. So it's a bit fuzzy, but this picture on the slide is an example of what the template looks like. And as you can see, it's very simple and guides people to list the job search activities they'll complete each day. And the program increased the number of job applications that people submitted and subsequently increased job offers and employment. And one of the key learnings here was just the importance of understanding how people behaved in order to design an effective policy response. So in this case, the researchers with their partners identified this gap between job seekers' intentions and their actual activities, which I think is an experience we can maybe all relate to in our own lives. And identifying this allowed them to design an effective solution to close that gap. Now, to look at an ongoing study of a digital job search solution, researchers are working with several partners in Iraq to learn from an online portal where youth can apply for jobs. Some job seekers are receiving information about the competitiveness of the job postings they view, specifically the number of other applicants who had already applied for the job. Others are receiving that same information, plus information about how the job search website's internal algorithm would rank them relative to existing applicants. And so the hope here is to identify how these different pieces of information influence search behavior, and whether giving people more information about their own competitiveness and how competitive different positions are can help young people to target their job search more effectively. So to close, I think it's a really exciting area for more research, looking at the intersection of technology and how people look for work. In the interest of time, I won't go into all of these, but wanted to highlight 3 key open questions that we see at the intersection of technology and job search. So for one, how can we leverage technology to certify the skills of job seekers, especially for job seekers who don't have a university degree, for example, or previous work experience? How can technology solutions help certify workers' skills so that employers can accurately assess their qualifications? Also, how can nudges and notifications close information gaps and encourage job search effort? We saw this play out in this very low-tech solution in the example I shared from South Africa, where encouraging job seekers to fill out a simple but actionable job search plan helped close a gap between what people aspired to do and what they actually did in their job search. There's a lot of room to explore how nudges and notifications on digital platforms, for example, can help job seekers navigate this job search process, which can often be very complicated. And then finally, how do we ensure that technology doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities when it comes to job access? And how do we ensure that the labor market becomes more and not less inclusive as it becomes more digital? So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I think your presentation addressed some of the comments I saw in the Q&A related to what are some of the specific things we can do with this knowledge in order to prepare people for that. And perhaps we can get into that into more detail later in the Q&A. But next, we'll be moving to Giselle Mota. So Giselle, whenever you're ready.
Well, thanks for having me, Derek. So, I come from the perspective, having worked with ADP, we are an HCM provider. We do payroll, benefits, the whole nine when it comes to this corporate space and enterprise organizations that I work with on a global space. And one of the things that I'm noticing is this convergence between the corporate world and the small business world, and how the pandemic has accelerated the future of work and actually given way to opportunities for entrepreneurs to be more inclusive and have a part of that prosperity, if you would. So I'd like to talk about that. One of the things that we've seen during the pandemic, if you think about particular industries, some of our clients who some of them are distributing alcohol or having to do grocery deliveries during this time. And imagine your own personal life, how haircuts, entertainment, special events, and celebrations have all become, we're rethinking those, and we're trying to reimagine how do we access those even as consumers. So now put yourself in the perspective of the organization. And when I say organization, it's the corporations, but it's also these small businesses and these entrepreneurs who have had to pivot. And that is the thing. This pivoting has happened. It's created this creativity and reimagining of how services are provided and how business can continue moving forward. So with that in mind, one of the projects that I work on is with the city of Houston. We work in conjunction with the city of Houston and this program called Interrise. They help entrepreneurs who are owned by minorities and underrepresented people. So I've been teaching both in the city of Tampa and the city of Houston, entrepreneurs who are underrepresented. And I wanted to share with you that 3 people in particular that I've seen with their businesses that have thrived during the pandemic. And so again, think about how entrepreneurs have thrived and they've pivoted during these times and the convergence between that and corporate world. So during this time, one of the Latino business owners, they have a janitorial company. They've boomed during this time, of course, because they've been the supplier for toilet paper and cleaning supplies, et cetera. Another one has owned commercial cleaning, and they were struggling with their business. However, given the pandemic, they created and pivoted a new approach to sanitizing directly related to the pandemic. So now they've partnered up, and all of a sudden the floodgates have opened with corporate clients who are interested in returning to the workplace safely. And so all of a sudden this small business has been able to tap into the world of corporate. Similarly, there's another organization who does metalwork, and they've been able to craft specific pieces of manufacturing machinery that, because of supply chain issues globally, certain corporations haven't been able to get their hands on certain pieces in time. So this has afforded the opportunity to so many entrepreneurs to be able to have a seat at the table and access opportunities that they wouldn't have before. And what we're seeing is that entrepreneurs are pivoting. These minority-owned organizations are thriving at the time. I'm actually organizing as well as part of ADP. I'm a part of our business resource group. And given everything that's happening with, diversity and social unrest and racial injustice, we are looking for people to speak up and to talk about disability inclusion, for example. Today, by the way, is Disability Inclusion Celebration Day internationally, so kudos on that. But as well as just, think about how we've been tapping, and I've been tapping into small business owners, minorities across the gamut of all types of gender identification, race and ethnicity identification, and now they're given the platform to interact with a corporation, speaking at an event, talking about what they have to offer as well. Now, as I wrap up here, so how and why is this possible? The main crux of this is agility. We have needed agility. The future of work has been talked about quite a bit over the past few years, but this pandemic has accelerated that. So thinkers and problem solvers who can adapt quickly and innovate at scale are exactly what is needed right now. And most companies, according to Forrester Group, they struggle when it comes to legacy business models. And this hinders their ability to leverage new technologies and transformation. These are key things that are needed during this time to pivot as a corporation as well. And where have we reached? Where have we turned? Well, to small business owners and to entrepreneurs and even intrapreneurs within the organization who formulate teams, who cross-collaborate, who are parts of innovation labs, and who come up with the new things that we need to pivot quickly at the moment. I'll tell you, within ADP, we partner up with other organizations, even small businesses, in our marketplace. We have one of the largest marketplaces in the HCM market, meaning if you have a product around wellness, around safety, engagement, rewards, benefits, whatever the case is, we bring all of that together, and that gives an opportunity to small business owners or entrepreneurs to be able to innovate, ideate, and merge and partner with corporations. So one of the ways, again, just to put a cap on this, is this pandemic has provided an opportunity at the corporate level internally, but also reaching out to formulate new business operating models, teams, dynamic teams internally, innovation hubs, and partnerships through even gig workers and entrepreneurs themselves. And now we're looking for them as our suppliers, we're looking for them as our partners, we're looking at them for speakers and engagement. Therefore, that gives way to minorities to have more of a seat at the table and more inclusion to that prosperity. So I'm happy about that. As a matter of fact, I'm glad this has provided that opportunity. Out of a pandemic, something positive is coming out in terms of inclusivity. Back to you, Derek. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I want to turn now to our next speaker, Kristin Sharp. So Kristin.
Derek, I just wanted to say thank you for convening the group and for inviting me to speak. As you mentioned, I run the Education Quality Outcomes Standards Board, which is a new-ish nonprofit organization focused on the ability to assess the quality of education and training providers that are helping people with sometimes traditional educational programs, but mostly accelerated, non-traditional career-connected programs, and ensuring that the state government programs, employers, and philanthropic community that is investing in those programs can assess the impact and know which ones are working well. I'm excited to go at this point in the discussion for a couple of reasons. One, because my former work before I got into the education world was in future of work, and specifically looking at the on-demand and gig economy and independent contracting workers. And my job now is thinking about what kinds of things we need to do to put the education structure in place to make that kind of entrepreneurialism a reality for more kinds of people. So I'm excited to be able to bridge those two discussions and two panels. One thing that I thought was interesting in the first panel was how all the different speakers focused on independent contracting as the seat of entrepreneurialism. I actually think that in the way the workforce is changing right now, there are lots of different kinds of ways to be entrepreneurial. There is, of course, being an independent contractor or somebody that is a small business owner, but there's also being sort of a remote worker in new technology or digitally enabled platforms. There's the digitization of traditional roles. So using digital tracking technology or iPads or different things in the construction world, or using advanced manufacturing techniques in the manufacturing world. And there are, as Giselle pointed out, sort of small business lifestyle related opportunities for people that weren't there before, and that focus on how to augment things in the care world, the service industry, the things that support all of the things that we're doing now and that have become particularly important in the pandemic. The thing that all of those different categories of new kinds of roles have in common is that they all require entrepreneurialism. So I think that it's really important to focus on what entrepreneurialism is defined as. And I always think of it as, one, the ability to have agency and control in whatever kind of work you do, however you generate income. Two, the ability to advocate for ideas, either your own or something in the employer that you work for. And three, the systems thinking required to put the different pieces together, both in sort of your own skills as the worker and what you need, what skills, experiences, life experiences you need to draw from and able to be, in order to be able to be good at a job, and sort of what you can do to advance an idea and sort of create new things and be an innovator within your existing role. And the thing that's been so interesting about transitioning from the future of work world into the education world is that not very much of our education structure is oriented around giving people that kind of entrepreneurial skill. And so looking very specifically and trying to transition the education world from thinking about just giving people knowledge and information to giving them the tools to be able to use that knowledge and information to have better real world results for them in the kind of work they do, is what my organization is trying to do. We're trying to incentivize all education and training programs to start thinking about how they become more entrepreneurial. We have gone through a process of evaluating the outcomes of a number of different individual providers and a number of different sort of aggregator systems or platforms that work with a number of education and training providers. And we've seen a couple things that indicate over and over again that a program will have good real world results. And those things tend to be in common, that a program focuses on the coaching, mentorship, social networking, and ability to be able to draw from different backgrounds, experiences, skills, and capabilities, and put all those pieces together in a new way. And it is really the ability to develop that roadmap as an individual and know sort of what technical competencies you need to have and how to combine those technical competencies with the confidence, the ability to advocate for yourself or your organization, and the other things that one has to do to be successful in a role. So I think that some of the questions that Lisa raised about how technologies can help get people on that pathway, get people on that roadmap, get them thinking about what they need to do and what they want to do within an employer situation to collect that set of skills is a really important and interesting thing. So I think that in the question and answer period, I'd love to see if folks have questions about how to further connect both what employers can do to evaluate the kinds of programs that actually give people those skills, or to institute the kinds of programs within their own organization that facilitate people's ability to be entrepreneurial. But I think that that's the thing that the education system and the future of work system needs to sort of coordinate on going forward. So I'll stop there and wait for the questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kristin. And now we'll be turning things over to Dr. Jim Spohrer.
Thank you. Okay, so Derek invited me, I believe we were recently on a panel together, an NSF panel with SRI, and I made some comments about artificial intelligence. I lead artificial intelligence, open source artificial intelligence at IBM, and my PhD's in computer science and artificial intelligence. In fact, when I graduated from MIT in the 1970s, I helped start an AI startup in the 70s. So I guess I'm the AI guy on this panel, and happy to be here. And thanks, Daryl, for the invitation. I will just share a couple slides, and I have a really pretty simple message that I would like to share with you today about the future. I'm pretty optimistic about the future, and I think maybe that's another reason why Daryl invited me to be here. So yeah, I'll post these slides to slideshare.net/Spohrer. Here's how you can get in touch with me. There's more future of work workshops coming up next week. I tend to do a lot of these days, and I love Derek's opening. I love the focus on phones, and I'm turning 65 in January of this year. So this is the phone that was on my wall in the farmhouse in Maine that I grew up with. This was the rotary phone on my MIT desk when I was at MIT in the 70s. This was my first Nokia smartphone when I moved to Silicon Valley to work for Apple, and after 10 years there, I moved over to IBM, and here is the iPhone I have today. And I'd like to encourage you to think about the future of work in terms of, these 20-year increments. What will people have by 2035, and what will we have by 2055? As you can see, this progression is going to be quite different. This is the first program I wrote in 1972 on punch cards when I led IBM's global university programs a few years ago. We gave free access to 300,000 faculty and students around the world to use our technology in the cloud, our AI technology in the cloud. This, there's a lot of hype around AI, but if you just look at computing power, you can see that, we're at an interesting point here in 2020 where you can get a terascale, which is a million instructions per second for about $1,000. The largest supercomputer in the world, the Summit supercomputer that IBM built for Oak Ridge National Labs, is up around 200, 250 petascale, costs tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. But our brains are an exascale, so we don't really get to an exascale at $1,000 till about 2060. But you can see over the next 20 years, from 2020 to 2040, this is the cost of a digital worker. What is a digital worker? You can think of the apps on your smartphone growing up. And so this is really key because as more and more people have digital workers, to go along with what Kristin said, we have to educate people to be more entrepreneurial. And out here in Silicon Valley, this really excites people because if you're an entrepreneur and you've got all these ideas, you got to hire your data scientist, you got to hire your AI guy, you got to hire your marketing person. And sorry, these are on auto advance, so I'm going to come back to this. But the GDP per employee is headed up. So I just want to go back to this slide. I grew up on a farm. We had apple trees. And think of apple trees as a technology. And I remember my father telling me when I was little, our wealth is correlated with the number of apple trees. So if you want something, go out and plant some more apple trees and use them in production. And we had cows and chickens. And so these were the resources that were creating the wealth for our family. And I consider my father a biological entrepreneur. Out here, as we get these digital workers, again, it's going to be the number of digital workers and how you use those digital workers. If you didn't take care of your apple trees, you didn't have a good crop. You got to take care of your digital workers. And this is really, the vision that a number of us have for why we're optimistic about the future. So if these timescales hold, what kind of skills do people want? At IBM, we talk about T-shaped people. This is the model that we have at IBM for aspiring employees. If you want to be a better IBMer, if you want to be more of an adaptive innovator, T-shaped adaptive innovator, you have to have broad knowledge of many disciplines, many industry sectors, and many cultures and regions. We're global, we're in all industries, so it's logical that you think like this. And the disciplines aren't just technology disciplines. You have to understand the new business models. And it's all about people at the end of the day. So we have courses that all IBMers take on advanced technology. Everybody at IBM is expected to know basics of artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, quantum computing, reg tech, green tech. The work practices we all have to learn are agile, service design, open source, which is the area I'm in, open source AI, and mindset. Arvind Krishna, our new CEO, says growth mindset, positive mindset, entrepreneurial mindset. And just to end on a final note, we really try to inspire the next generation to build a better world. And as Kristin said, education really has to change. In fact, you can imagine education in a few years as much more of a team sport, less of individual sport, where even young students empowered by these digital workers are going to be able to make, citizen science discoveries and other innovations. So I'll stop here and turn it back over to Derek, but hopefully that gives you a sense of the perspective I'll bring to the discussion today.
Great, thank you so much. So I wanted to turn first to the Q&A. So thank you to everyone who's attending that's asked some questions. Do my best to cover as much ground as we can during this time. And I think maybe one way to start is to think about kind of the regional aspects or the role of geography in this topic. I think Lisa started certainly with explaining what JPAL has done across the globe, and that certainly lessons in the U.S. based on what's being done there too. But then we heard that in the first hour, for those of you that were able to join us for the first hour, that there's certainly a geographic component to the changes that COVID's accelerated, and that can be really beneficial in some respects. But there are certainly some concerns there as well too, and there's some questions related to how has this disrupted like supply chains? And Giselle kind of talked about the opportunities it's creating as well too. So I just kind of wanted to open it up for some more comments by any of the panelists kind of related to this about how we think about the opportunity. I really like the way Giselle phrased it, like, we've got this opportunity that's come out of this, very horrific thing. And it's nice to be able to focus on some of the positive things right now, especially. But I guess I'd just be curious for comments on how we make sure that that's actually available to as many people as possible.
I think just to add on there, so one of the ways I saw a question in there, hello, Gary, I see you out here. So one of the things that I mentioned was how ADP has a marketplace. So for anyone listening, or, even it's not just ADP, there's also just larger enterprise organizations that are similar to our model that have marketplaces. But for us, you can go to partnerships.adp.com. That's again, partnerships.adp.com. In our marketplace, I'll put the link in the chat as well. But basically, we're open. It's like, we're listening and we're curating different people who want to partner, even if you're geographically located somewhere else. So please do let us know what you have to offer. And Jim mentioned AI. We'd love to hear more solutions based on AI. So if you're an innovator out there listening to this, please reach out and think of anything, the gamut of the whole life cycle of an employee. We'd love to hear what you have to offer. Just the other day, we helped someone, or we were listening to someone with a disability app to help, now we're like on Zoom today. It's very difficult if someone's hearing impaired to be able to engage and have conversation just like anyone who, as easy as someone who's able to hear. So there's an app out there that's making that, that's facilitating that, and we want to hear from them. So that's one way. Another way is within the HCM space, think about teaming. And so the great thing about remote work is the ability to bring people together and think about the multivariance of diversity. People are so different. They come from so many different spaces. Cognitive diversity is key. We want those skills that Kristin was talking about. And that skills economy is what it is right now for the future of work. So being able to bring people together across regions, wherever you're located, through a platform system that can enable this teaming to happen is what we're also working on, and what I see many organizations are moving towards as well.
Yeah, and I'd also add, just because we talked a little bit about the educational structure that supports that, and Jim specifically asked in his comments, like, what can we do to support that? And I think that some of the tech platforms that are out there that are because of the sort of unexpected advantage of the pandemic that has forced every educational program to at least think about how to go online virtually, there is more opportunity to make groups and project work that is more inclusive, that is more, geographically, demographically, every kind of diversity in the group, and that we're seeing in education, some of the programs get ahead if they have a process for certifying and validating that project work has happened and that the learning has taken place in that project work. And so I think that my recommendation on the ed front would be for lots of different kinds of programs to start thinking about what kinds of validation there is for their project work and how to get as many people involved as possible.
Absolutely. I'll pile on and just mention that, all of the, there's so many, from Udacity to edX, Google has programs, Amazon has programs, IBM. We all have programs for education on a wide range of technologies, and these are all platform-based, freely available. Many of them have certifications and badges that go along with them. Through the pandemic, my youngest son actually took our data science program. He had 4 weeks to kill, so he took it and got his IBM badges for data science, which made me proud. I do think that the other point is these technologies are getting easier and easier to use. Most of us have a smartphone, and as our apps grow up and become digital workers, they'll have speech interfaces, they'll have all the capabilities that make it easier and easier to use. So when I mentor students, and I mentor a lot of students, I say, so tell me what you would do if you had 100 workers working for you. And their face goes blank. And I said, that's the world you're going to be entering. And if you don't know what you're going to do with 100 workers, Steve Jobs knew what to do with hundreds of workers. All the entrepreneurs know, you can't do it alone. As smart as you are, you're not going to be able to do it alone. You're going to have to delegate work. You're going to have to organize work. You're going to have to manage work. And so start thinking about, what you're passionate about, what change you'd like to bring into the world that would require, hundreds of people working for you. And that's the world we are entering. So I think if we can inspire the next generation to go out and start learning, be excited about learning, motivated to learn, think about the things they want to accomplish, dream bigger, have larger aspirations, I think that's the best preparation. And I'm really excited that this COVID, as horrible as it's been for so many, has really accelerated the education process into the digital world. That's huge. And I think it's really going to help the next generation.
I think I kind of want to build off that point, maybe with a related question, which is something I think about a lot, which is if you would have told me what the internet was, like when I was a child, I would have thought that meant that the small town that I lived in could be as successful as a big town because it would eliminate the role of place. And that's certainly not been the case. A lot of technological advances create tremendous wealth, but it's also tremendously concentrated. And thinking through things like the advent of and the growth of platforms, they certainly open up the doors to allow small firms to prosper, but they're prospering on very large platforms. Those platforms only work at scale. So, and in another way, they also they open up a different type, I think, of entrepreneurship and opportunities. And these tech solutions, there's a couple levels of access. There's like a technical one. Do you have like the actual computing capabilities to access? As Jim just mentioned, phones and the technology is getting much easier to use, so that's getting lower. But then there's also the skills and training, like, do I know how to really take advantage of it? Am I able to unlock all of the potential? And so I'd love to get some thoughts from this panel or anyone on the previous panel who would like to comment, perhaps, just to talk about how do we make sure that we take advantage of the opportunity that COVID has kind of forced us to try and learn so many things, and we can see tremendous benefits. And I guess just kind of dive in deeper and more specifically to how to make sure that prosperity is shared. It's a real softball, so anyone can start.
I can start with a few thoughts on this, and I think it's a super interesting question, Derek. And one thing that we've been thinking about a lot with respect to like how to increase inclusive access to these jobs is I think, you know, for young, particularly for like young job seekers who are like new to the labor market, but I think you could think about this for anyone, like including us, like it's just like a really complicated process to identify like what are the jobs in the labor market and what do I need to like be qualified for that. And so I think one thing that we're really interested in terms of like areas for open research is like, how does information and like what are the right points at which to give someone information about what are the jobs that are out there and what does it take to get those jobs. And I think I feel like this is still a bit of like a really open question, like how do you do this well, especially when there are, you know, when there's like access problems to that information. And so one thing that we're interested in exploring, for example, is, you know, if you give someone information before they've even decided what training program to embark on, right? Like, does that influence things? And does that like, do they take that information? Does that actually help them in thinking about like what training they're going to invest in to be qualified for the jobs that are out there? So not really answers, but I guess just more questions that we've been thinking about, but just to share from our perspective.
One thing that I think could be interesting just as a philosophical shift more than anything else is transitioning away from thinking about helping students and learners get jobs to transitioning to helping them think about how to earn income. And it's because earning income is so much more inclusive and expansive a concept, and you can do it in so many different ways. You can have an anchor job and then also supplement or augment that with outside income. You can think about the income itself as self-employment income or something that you do from a small business. And I'd say in order to back that up, to start thinking about the metrics for how we look at education programs and employer programs as how we're helping people think about their pathways to earning income. We actually changed one of our metrics in terms of evaluating the outcomes of programs away from evaluating placement as placement into a job to placement that includes placement into a job, the ability to earn or to start a small business or earn additional outside income as the measures rather than just the traditional measure. And starting to do all of those kinds of things, I think, can be really helpful.
Yeah, that rethinking is also necessary, even within the corporate space, to be those providers of opportunities for others as well. So we're rethinking, and what we're seeing in the future of work is a rethinking of who the workforce is. And so even within ADP, the structures that we have, we're being able to bring in through something called Work Market, you know, gig workers, but then we have another platform to merge gig workers to be a part of a team of full-time employees, and being able to bring people in now and just rethinking, what does a team look like? What are they comprised of? Is it all this one group of employees that I have to go through this traditional onboarding process and our performance? It's different. It's different now. We're bringing in different people. And we're looking at skills. We're working on a skills oncology to be able to break down jobs and understand what are the skills needed for each of those jobs, and then create pathways for that. To your point that you mentioned about certain pathways for training, for succession, for what do we do based on the skills. So I think, yeah, we're moving more towards that. And there's an opportunity because of that for an employer to think with a more open mind, where do I source this skill set from? How do I equip them with what they need? And it opens the playing field. And that's why like I said before, I'm excited for the times and the way that this is moving.
That is such a great point, Giselle. And I've seen a couple big employers start thinking about incorporating their suppliers into some of the planning for pathways and those kinds of things too, both in terms of shoring up the sort of small businesses that they work with, and in thinking about how those people contribute to their teams. That's an important point.
I'd like to just add, I really like, Kristin, what you said, thinking about earning instead of jobs. And there's so many opportunities for people to earn outside of a job these days. And that's growing at an increasing rate. And anyway, there's some great reports that are in the presentation I have about the labor platforms versus the capital platforms, and how much people in different cities, the ones who are active in these platforms, are earning. And it's quite complementary, I think, to this notion that it really is about thinking about experience. At IBM, we'd rather hire somebody from a failed startup than usually somebody coming out as an undergraduate, because, failure is part of learning in life. And, but they've learned real world experiences. They probably had to learn agile. They probably had to learn a lot of work practices in the workplace in the startup that they won't learn in traditional undergraduate education. And I think that notion of focusing on earning as early as possible is the right mindset shift to have more of a positive perspective, to have more of a growth mindset. And that will make it more inclusive, I believe, as well. And also, I guess I have more questions than I have answers, but I'd love to see more data at the under the roof structure. A lot of the analysis I'm seeing is based on individuals, but I know a lot of people, like my sons, moved back in when the crisis hit, and that gave them the flexibility to dabble in even more startups in Silicon Valley than they were before. And so I think that has really been a positive thing, and it'd be interesting to look at the structure of dependence, independence, ratio of earning to earning from traditional jobs that's happening under the roof structure. I'd love to see some analysis of that if anybody has data. The one thing that did, Lisa, concern me when I read the MIT Future of Work report was David had said the urban escalator is broken, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around that. But if that's the case, then this goes to Derek's point about he would have thought the internet would have been I could work from anywhere, and no, there is an advantage to being in places where you can interact with lots of people who have lots of experience. That's what it's about, is getting that experience, getting those interactions, being out there, interacting on platforms, interacting ideally in person once this vaccine is out. But I think that's really, Kristin, that point about earning. We can't overemphasize that. We've got to get people thinking about earning and exploring multiple options for earning in parallel.
Thank you, everyone. I want to move on to one of the questions in the Q&A that I think has been addressed to some degree, but I think it's worded uniquely enough that I want to mention it directly. And it's phrased as, what are the thoughts on how leveraging tech enables entrepreneurship? Do the same mechanisms which were discussed regarding access to work also enable entrepreneurship, or do you think they are going to be different? So I know that we've discussed at various points the platform, that creates a platform, but tech can also change the way you grow. I know some of the earlier presenters talked about the tools. It's just a lot cheaper. There are technological tools that make it much easier to start a business, or much cheaper potentially, and that might change the way it's structured. But we'd love to get feedback from that group.
I'll just have something very brief. I think UBI for people between 20 and 30 years old makes a lot of sense to me. I know that's not totally universal, but I think this earning thing should be explored. Earning and experience should be explored, and I think a UBI, general healthcare, all of that would be super important. And there's even stuff out there on corporate funded UBI that I encourage people to go do a web search on corporate funded UBI, because the big platforms are all competing for collaborators. They want the youth on their platform for very, very important business regions. So corporate funded and government funded UBI from the ages of 20 to 30, while people are exploring all of these options for earning before they maybe even have to go out and get a job, could be a huge, huge on-ramp for upskilling.
Yeah, and Jim, you mentioned something earlier around how these technologies are becoming, I guess you said, they're kind of easier to access or something. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but you made me think about how a lot of even artificial intelligence and analytics, et cetera, are becoming more productized. So it's the ability to be able to get a regular manager who has no data science background, access to data insights on their people, just so that they could see it on their phone like they would interact with anything else. It's that, to me, big businesses are having to rethink how they operate and how they get information into the hands of people. To me, that provides an opportunity for small businesses. Again, if you are someone who is developing any type of idea around artificial intelligence, around data analytics, any type of democratizing the experience of AI and data at all, then this is a great time to reach out to these organizations who are too big sometimes to turn around and make these ideations themselves. And just, you know, to me, that's how it's creating opportunities for entrepreneurs.
I think it's about, in a lot of ways, just de-risking being an entrepreneur. And Jim's point of UBI is one way to do that. It's a good option potentially because it de-risks the ability to take a risk. But and it goes to the point from the panel number one today too, that you in people who work in the on-demand world or the independent contractor world, you often see them either as professional level jobs that have already established themselves in the working world or older workers. And that's in large part because those workers have pensions or spouses that provide the stability. And so the ability to provide that stability in other ways is what we should be thinking about. But government isn't the only way to do that potentially. There's also tech platforms that sort of provide the checklist of like, here's what you do. And there's more access to capital and more visibility into what those pathways are that employers can do from the top down, or that you know, sort of nonprofit social service organizations can do from the bottom up. And it's, you know, I think that we need to leverage all of those different kinds of stakeholders in how we de-risk.
Yeah, Kristin, I think that's such a great point around, you know, de-risking. I think one other thing that we've been thinking about is at JPAL is sort of how, you know, especially in light of the pandemic, like how can technology be a source of like providing information to especially really small businesses who, you know, we've seen, I think in the US, how like they're maybe less likely than the larger companies to like access these like relief services and things like that. So are there ways to like provide more information as well to help small businesses stay afloat and things like that, and how technology can be a source for that as well? So.
I'd like to expand maybe a little bit on some of that just came up there, because it certainly did resonate in the first panel as well too, thinking through what risk means. And you know, I think very quickly, if you start talking about entrepreneurship, you start quickly talking about risk taking, and that might be the common thread, no matter how you might define an entrepreneur, you know, whether that's a small business owner, self-employment, or building up a portfolio of work. There's some level of risk, and it kind of almost on the opposite end of the spectrum is the concept of stability in terms of like having something to fall back on. And I'd just be curious to get some perspectives on, you know, what's a good way to think about kind of the trade-off between flexibility. You know, that's certainly one of the benefits that, you know, technology has enabled, is ability for some flexibility, whether that's in traditional employment arrangements for certain workers who are able to work remotely, or whether that's being able to pick hours in some of the, you know, elements of like almost micro entrepreneurship versus the trade-off, the stability, and you know, what is the right type of support structure for that trade-off. I think that was, you know, certainly addressed earlier, but love to get some additional comments on everyone about how to think through kind of that balance.
I think as organizations, especially coming from the HCM world and HR, as they start to see people as more of a skill set than the summation of all your jobs on a resume, and you have to stay with the company forever, and you build, that's changing. And I think I won't get into all the details here on that, but I know a lot of people are looking into like blockchain so that you can take your credentials with you and you can basically the mobility of your skills. And as more organizations are thinking that way, I think they're rethinking the worker. They're rethinking, you know, it's going to be more normal for someone to have more than one role or more than one job or more than one source of income, to Kristin's point, and take those skills and continue to build upon them as you move around wherever you're needed. So I think we're actually learning from the gig economy. And to Kristin's points earlier, you know, I was reading this report and it was amazing to me to learn how much gig workers own their skills development more than even just a regular full-time employee. And so we are learning from what we're observing from the gig workers in the gig economy, and we're bringing these thoughts and processes into our regular world. So I think that maybe that's one way we're going to see a change happening.
I love that point of own your skills and own your work in general. Like that's to Jim's earlier question of how do we infuse that into curricula? It's like that concept of how do we think about giving people agency, both visibility first, but then agency second in how they get the different skills that they need.
There are a couple additional questions still in the Q&A. We probably have time to get to one or two quickly, potentially, but thinking through some of the ways to get access. Technology can also provide entrepreneurs access, and then kind of the second end of the spectrum, thinking through that workforce development piece. So the skills we talk about that people might need. This question I think is phrased really well here. When thinking about the future of education, I usually hear we should train more creative and emotional intelligence skills. How do we know these skills will not also be replaced? How do we adapt our education to the future workforce demand? And I think relatedly, some say like the useful lifespan of of learning a specific technical skill has a limit, and sometimes it takes longer to learn it than it does before it's obsolete. And so I guess kind of thinking about some of these interconnected issues, how do we kind of help best prepare for the unknown, especially as things are rapidly changing?
Yeah, I see Borja Brado's question about that, Derek, and there's some great work in the service research literature. Sorry, I don't have the URL handy to paste in, but Meilin Fang and Roland Russ from the University of Maryland have been publishing a series of work in service research that does look at emotional intelligence and when that will likely be quote unquote automatable. And it is something to think about. It definitely, if you look at my roadmap, it's not till 2080 that we get an exascale at $1,000, assuming the trends continue. So we've got some decades ahead here. And I think the key thing isn't so much, to me, automation is augmentation. It really is the case that as we as individuals get more powerful tools, some that understand emotional intelligence, we can use those tools in ways that, expand the capability and range of things that people can do in their interactions with each other. And let's not forget that, it's the assets, these AI systems, we're working a lot on trusted AI because a lot of the slow adoption of AI is about the trust. Can we really trust this for handing over? And they can't take responsibility. They don't own assets. It's the organizations and individuals that own these AI technologies that have those capabilities. But yeah, you're right. It's further out, I think, than most people think. Most people are worried, oh, this automation is going to hit me tomorrow, and it's not. It's very much the case that most of these things are decades into the future. And I think if we can prepare the next generation to be earners with multiple sources of earning and inspire them to use their digital workers in new ways, just like, again, I like this analogy with the biological, the farmers. I think it's going to be more like it was 200 years ago. Somebody mentioned Jefferson's ideal vision back in the early days, and it is going to be the case that the more you can take those digital assets, just like in the past it was your biological assets, and use those digital assets to the benefit of you and your family, you're going to gain and prosper. And that's, I think, the better way to think about it, that rather than, I'm narrowly defining myself in terms of these skills and, oh, I'm so afraid I'm going to be automated. Yeah, you've got a closed mindset. You don't have a growth mindset. I was in a cab in Naples, and, I used to joke with the cabbie, yeah, I'm from Silicon Valley, and we're working on AI for driverless vehicles. What do you think about that? And I loved the reaction. It was bipolar. Half of them were, oh, you crazy people in Silicon Valley, you're going to put me out of a job. Somebody should put a stop to you all. And the others, this cab driver in Naples says, oh, I can't wait. I'll have a fleet of driverless vehicles delivering passengers all over Naples. I'll be rich. I'll be at home with my babies and drinking cappuccino with my wife. So it really is, we just have to inspire the next generation to look at these digital assets like previous generations looked at the biological assets, and those who can use those assets creatively and interacting with others will prosper.
That's what I mentioned before about pivoting, and why I found it amazing that these entrepreneurs have found that, hey, like I mentioned before, someone had a question in the chat about disruptions in supply chain. That example that I gave about the Latino business owner who's a metal worker. So he basically has manufactured parts of equipment pieces that people were not able to get from China, were not able to get from overseas during the start of the pandemic, especially. But he manufactured them, and all of a sudden he has a contract with one of the largest manufacturing producers here in the city of Houston, just like that. And so that mindset that you mentioned, Jim, is that when we see that one way doesn't work anymore, it's that entrepreneurial mindset of how can I pivot? How do I change? And then moving forward with it. I love it.
Giselle, if I can just add on that, I love this idea of like pivoting and entrepreneurial mindset. I think is so important. One thing that some of the researchers in our network did was sort of compare an entrepreneurship training for like micro enterprises, a training, sorry, this was from some researchers at the World Bank, and then some folks in our network have been doing kind of build off work on this, is comparing like a traditional sort of business training program for micro entrepreneurs, teaching like traditional business skills, accounting, things like that, and then comparing that to this personal initiative training of like, how do you solve problems? How do you overcome these barriers? And actually like doing really practical, like training, like case studies, like within this training. And that was found to be like much more effective. And so in the case where they studied it, so thinking about expanding that, I think it's like, yeah, just a really important point you bring around how like maybe the like specific technical skills are less important, but the ability to like adapt and overcome problems is going to be what helps you like really thrive. So yeah, just to echo your point, I think it's excellent.
I think that's probably a great point to end on. And I'm so glad that our conversation today had, some positivity to it too, because, this has been a super challenging year for so many and in many different ways. But I want to thank, all the panelists. I don't know about everyone listening, but I certainly learned so much, and I had lots of questions. I have even more. And despite that, I think I learned so much. And I'm really excited about the work that everyone we got to hear from is doing, and I think that we have some tremendous opportunities here for to rebuild better as we come out of this pandemic. And so I want to thank all the panelists for their time and joining us, and everyone who joined us today to listen in. And we'll have videos up from this presentation at a later date, and encourage everyone to follow our work here and check out the next forum coming up in January. So until then, be well, everyone.